It was an ordinary shift for the factory worker, routine checks, equipment maintenance, and the hum of heavy machinery in the background. But as he walked past one of the machines, something caught his eye, a small hand, barely visible beneath the massive gears and parts. His heart skipped a beat. Was it a child? Panic surged through him as he bent down, the reality hitting him fast. There was no time to waste. He knew immediately what had to be done. He had to act fast. The boy was hiding under the machinery, and every second counted. John Miller had worked at the industrial factory for over 10 years. His life, like many others in the factory, revolved around the daily grind. The heavy clang of metal, the whir of machines, and the constant need for maintenance were all he knew. His hands were calloused from years of working with tools, and his eyes were sharp from the constant need to monitor the machinery around him. The factory was large, filled with rows of dangerous, unforgiving equipment, and every worker knew their role by heart. John was no different. Each day, he arrived before dawn, clocked in, and got to work. His job wasn't glamorous. He was part of the team responsible for maintaining the machines that kept the factory running, ensuring that everything operated smoothly. Every so often, there would be a minor issue, an oil leak here, a machine breakdown there. But for the most part, it was all predictable. Routine. It wasn't an easy job, but it paid well. And in a city like theirs, that was all that mattered. John didn't expect excitement, and he certainly didn't expect to be faced with life-or-death decisions on the factory floor. But this morning was different. He had been assigned his usual rounds, checking on the larger machines in the back of the factory, machines that were notoriously hard to fix and, in some cases, dangerous to approach. These machines were huge, heavy, and required great care when inspecting. John was no stranger to the risks. He had been trained for years on how to stay safe. The noise, the heat, the grease, it all blended together into a familiar, almost comforting environment for him. He had checked on most of the machines, walking down the factory floor, glancing at the monitors showing the machinery status. The factory was empty of workers for now. The production shift wouldn't start until later in the morning. As he moved toward one of the older, massive machines, one he had inspected countless times, a faint sound caught his attention. It wasn't the usual hum of the factory. This was something different. A small noise that seemed out of place. Curious, he moved closer. What he saw next would change everything. John's boots echoed on the factory floor as he made his way toward the towering machine in the back corner. The large piece of equipment hummed low, its metal parts shifting slightly as the cooling system worked to keep it from overheating. The workers usually avoided getting too close unless absolutely necessary, as it had a reputation for being unpredictable. He had just begun scanning the panel to check for any signs of wear or malfunction when a strange noise, like a faint whimper, reached his ears. He froze. John was used to the clanking and whirring of the machines. He knew the factory's noises better than anyone. But this sound was different. Soft. Almost like a breath or a whisper. He turned his head slowly, eyes scanning the shadows that were cast under the machinery. There, in the dim light, something shifted. His heart began to race as he leaned down to peer under the machine. At first, he thought it might be a rat. There had been occasional vermin sightings in the factory, but as his eyes adjusted, the reality of the situation hit him like a wave. There, hidden beneath the massive machine, was a small hand, tiny, fragile fingers, their pale skin almost glowing in the faint light. John's stomach churned, and his mind immediately went into overdrive. What in the world was a child doing here? He could hardly believe his eyes. The hand was trembling, the fingers curling and uncurling as though trying to reach for something or someone. John knelt down, trying to get a better view of whatever or whoever was underneath the machinery. He noticed the boy's arm, then his legs, pressed against the cold metal. The boy was curled up, small and vulnerable, wedged in between the machine's rotating parts and the factory floor. The sight froze John for a moment. The factory floor was a labyrinth of heavy, unforgiving machinery. If something went wrong, if the machine moved even slightly, the boy could be crushed, trapped, or worse. John's mind raced. How did he get here? How long had he been hiding? He could barely hear the boy's breath now, shallow and quick, like he was too scared to even make a sound. The urgency of the situation slammed into John. He quickly scanned the area. It wasn't like any of the other maintenance workers had reported a missing child. There had been no sign of any such disturbance. This was completely out of place. John's instincts kicked in. He couldn't waste time figuring out how the boy ended up here. The first thing was to get him out fast. Without thinking about the risks, John dove into action. His hands trembled as he reached under the machine, his fingers brushing the boy's arm. The child flinched, eyes wide with fear, locking onto John's gaze as if he couldn't believe someone was there. Hey, it's okay. I'm not going to hurt you, John murmured, his voice gentle but hurried. The boy didn't speak, but his fearful eyes followed John's every movement. He looked terrified. His clothes were torn and filthy, his body bruised, as if he had been through something harsh. There were no obvious signs of serious injury, but he was clearly in distress. John's hands were shaking as he gently tried to lift the boy out of the tight spot. The machinery loomed over them like a giant, its cold metal threatening to move at any moment. One wrong move, and it could all end in tragedy. The boy's body was small enough to fit under the machine, but that also meant he was wedged in tight. Come on, I need you to move with me, okay? John urged, trying to keep his voice steady, though his heart was hammering. The boy didn't respond, but his eyes flicked between John and the massive machine above them. John made a split-second decision. He quickly grabbed a nearby tool, a crowbar, using it to pry open a small gap between the machine and the floor. With his free hand, he grabbed the boy, trying to pull him out, but the child was frozen in fear. John's mind raced. There's no time. I have to get him out, now. He adjusted his grip, pulling the boy slightly upward, trying not to hurt him. It's okay. I've got you. Just a little more. As he pulled harder, he felt a jolt, a shift in the machinery's weight. No. The machine creaked, and John froze, his blood running cold. It was beginning to move. Slowly, but it was enough. The machine had a tendency to shift when disturbed. John's instincts screamed at him to stop, to pull back, but he couldn't. The boy was so close to being free. Please, no, John whispered, gritting his teeth as he pulled one final time. With a sharp tug, the boy slid free, his body coming out from under the machine with an alarming ease. John cradled him to his chest, holding him tight as he backed away from the machine. The metal part above them groaned, but John didn't stop. The boy was out. He was safe. For now. John didn't wait to catch his breath. He quickly moved toward the emergency exit, the boy still in his arms, trembling with fear. They had made it out of the immediate danger, but the situation wasn't over. The factory was a large, noisy place, and anything could happen. John needed to get the boy somewhere safe, away from the machinery, away from the chaos. Stay with me, he said, though he wasn't sure the boy could even hear him. He glanced down at the fragile, scared child in his arms. You're okay. You're safe now. As John backed away from the machinery, the weight of what had just happened began to settle on him. He was still holding the boy tightly, but his mind was racing, assessing the situation. The boy was small and frail, trembling uncontrollably in his arms. John could feel the boy's heartbeat against his chest, erratic and fast, matching the rhythm of his own. But there was no time to calm down. The danger wasn't over. Not yet. The factory was still eerily quiet. The low hum of the machines in the distance felt deafening in the silence. John knew he had barely a few moments before things could go horribly wrong. He quickly surveyed the area, trying to think of what to do next. The emergency exit was just a few feet away, but his instincts told him that he couldn't just run without ensuring the boy was okay first. He needed to check for injuries and figure out what had happened. John knelt down, still cradling the boy, and gently set him on the floor. The boy's eyes were wide, filled with fear, but there was a faint recognition in his gaze. John's heart ached. He could see the child was scared, no, terrified. His clothes were dirty, ragged, and torn in places. There were visible bruises on his arms, and his knees were scraped, as though he'd been crawling or running for some time. Hey, John said softly, trying to keep his voice steady. Are you okay? Can you tell me what happened? What are you doing here? The boy didn't respond. His lips trembled, but no words came out. John glanced around quickly. There were no signs of anyone else in the factory, no other people. Just the two of them, alone in the cavernous space. How had the boy gotten here? What was he doing hiding under the machinery? John pressed on, trying to get some answers. Did someone bring you here? Or were you hiding? The boy's wide eyes flickered toward the machinery, as if afraid the answer might bring some kind of threat. He shook his head slowly, not making a sound. John cursed under his breath. He had to get the boy out of the factory. He needed to get help. The boy was obviously in distress, and John didn't know how much longer the factory would remain secure. The situation was dangerous. There was no telling whether the other machines might suddenly start up, or if anyone else might be inside, causing trouble. The risk was too high. All right, John said gently, picking the boy up again, feeling the child's small body trembling against him. He needed to get to safety. But his mind raced with questions he didn't have answers to. Who was this boy? Why was he in the factory? Why was he hiding under a machine, of all places? John hurried toward the emergency exit, but something caught his eye. The large factory door, the one that should have been locked, was slightly ajar. A chill ran down his spine. He could hear faint voices on the other side, voices that didn't belong. Who else was here? Without hesitation, John grabbed the boy tighter in his arms and began backing away from the door. His steps were quick but calculated. He didn't want to make any noise. The last thing he needed was someone to notice him, especially if the situation was as dangerous as it seemed. He wasn't sure if the voices outside were a threat, but his instincts told him to be cautious. He couldn't afford to take chances. "Shook," John whispered, trying to reassure the boy, though he wasn't sure the child could even understand him in that moment. They were cornered. The emergency exit was their best shot, but now the risk was even higher. The noise from outside was growing louder, footsteps, muffled voices, and a low engine hum. It was clear now that someone was out there, and John couldn't let them find him or the boy. He had to think fast. John's mind raced. Should he go for the door anyway? Or was it safer to wait and see what was happening outside? He glanced at the boy. His eyes were wide and full of fear, his tiny body stiff in John's arms. The worker's heart ached with sympathy, but he also felt the growing pressure of the situation. He needed to get the child to safety, no matter what it took. Taking a deep breath, John made his decision. He moved away from the door, shifting to a nearby hallway that led deeper into the factory. The factory's layout was a maze of long corridors and hidden sections. If he could find a more secure spot, a place where they could hide for a moment and assess the situation, he could figure out their next move. John ducked into one of the nearby storage rooms, a place where workers usually kept tools and extra parts. He quickly closed the door behind him, making sure it was locked and the boy was safe. The room was dimly lit, with scattered boxes and crates lining the shelves. It was a tight space, but for now, it would have to do. He sat the boy down on an empty crate, his hands still shaking with adrenaline. The boy hadn't said a word, but his eyes were darting around the room, looking for an escape. His breathing was shallow, his small chest rising and falling rapidly. John could feel the panic radiating off the boy. "I'm going to keep you safe," John whispered, trying to calm himself as much as the boy. "We're going to figure this out. Just stay with me, okay?" The boy nodded faintly, still too scared to speak. The minutes seemed to stretch on forever as John waited in the dim light of the storage room. The voices outside were getting louder, but there was no sign of anyone coming through the door yet. He had no idea who they were or what they wanted, but it was clear that the boy wasn't supposed to be here. Whoever was out there was looking for him, and that thought made John's blood run cold. His heart hammered in his chest. The factory was no longer a place of routine and work. It had become a dangerous, unpredictable environment. The boy wasn't the only one in danger now. John sat in the storage room with the boy, the sound of muffled footsteps and distant voices creeping through the walls, setting his nerves on edge. Every minute felt like an eternity as he weighed his options. The boy was still trembling, sitting on a crate with wide, fearful eyes, his fragile form a reminder of how dire the situation had become. John's heart raced in his chest. He needed to make a decision, and fast. He checked the time. It had been almost 20 minutes since he found the boy. In that short span, his mind had gone from disbelief to full-on panic, and now the reality of what needed to be done was clear. The factory wasn't just an ordinary workplace anymore. It was a trap. The voices outside had stopped for a moment, and the silence felt even more suffocating than before. John's breathing was shallow, his hands slick with sweat. He kept glancing toward the door, half expecting someone to burst in at any moment. It was clear that whoever was out there wasn't looking for anything good. There was no time to waste. He had to get the boy out of there now. John looked around the storage room. It wasn't much of a hideout. The room was narrow, with only a few crates and scattered tools. But it was better than nothing. He tried to calm the boy, who was still too frightened to speak. "We'll be okay. I just need you to stay with me, all right?" His voice was low and steady, but inside, he felt anything but calm. His eyes darted to the nearby exit. It was only a few feet away, but the danger was clear. If he and the boy made a run for it, they'd be exposed, vulnerable. The worker's instinct screamed at him to stay hidden, but deep down, he knew he couldn't just sit here and wait for help that might never come. If there was one thing John had learned over the years, it was that waiting too long in a crisis often made things worse. John carefully scooped the boy back into his arms, trying not to startle him. The child flinched slightly but didn't pull away. John knew the boy was terrified, but there was no time to waste on reassurances anymore. The child needed to be moved, and fast. I can't let him down, John thought. I won't. The boy's light weight in his arms was a stark contrast to the weight of responsibility John now carried. He had no idea who was after the child or why, but it was clear that this wasn't some random occurrence. Whoever was looking for the boy didn't have good intentions. John took a deep breath, steadying himself. All right, he whispered, his voice calm but firm. Let's get out of here. He moved quickly to the back of the storage room, keeping low to the ground. The factory's loud machinery continued to drone on in the background, but it felt like it was miles away now, the hum a constant reminder of how far from normal things had gone. Every creak of the floor beneath his boots made him flinch. He had no idea how much time they had before someone came looking. With the boy still in his arms, John reached the small back door. He paused, listening carefully for any signs of movement outside. The silence was deafening. He pushed open the door slowly, just enough to peek out. The factory yard was dimly lit, with only the occasional flicker of light from the nearby streetlights casting shadows on the pavement. It was deserted, but that didn't mean it was safe. John squinted into the darkness, scanning the area for any sign of the people who had been talking outside. He could make out the silhouette of a black SUV parked by the far end of the yard, its headlights still off. The sight made John's stomach drop. The vehicle looked out of place, and something about it didn't feel right. Was that the car the boy had been trying to escape from? Stay quiet, John whispered to the boy, who nodded silently in response, his wide eyes never leaving John's face. The child's hand gripped John's sleeve tightly as they slowly moved toward the yard. John kept to the shadows, trying to stay as hidden as possible. He needed to make it to the exit at the other end of the yard, where there was a gate leading to a less monitored street. Once they were out of the factory grounds, they would be safe for now. But with every step, John's anxiety grew. He could still hear the distant voices, but they seemed to be moving away from him. Perhaps they hadn't noticed the open door? John didn't care. He couldn't afford to take chances. As they approached the gate, John's grip tightened on the boy, and he pushed the gate open just enough for them to slip through. He was almost there. They were almost out. But then, a loud bang echoed from the other side of the yard. The sound of a car door slamming. John's heart dropped into his stomach. The voices outside grew louder, closer. He had no choice now. He had to keep moving, or they would be caught. The boy whimpered softly in his arms, and John tightened his hold on him, feeling the child's frail body trembling. He had to get them out. They couldn't afford to be discovered. He ducked behind a pile of crates, his breath coming in shallow bursts. The boy looked up at him, still silent but shaking. John pressed a finger to his lips. Stay quiet. They crouched in the shadows, John's body tense with anticipation, waiting for the voices to pass. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as the footsteps got closer and closer. John's mind raced through every possible escape route he could take. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the voices grew faint again. The footsteps faded away, and John exhaled, relieved, but still unsure of what to do next. The danger wasn't over. He needed to keep the boy safe, but he had no idea who these people were or what they wanted with him. John took another deep breath and slowly moved forward, making sure to stay in the shadows, his eyes constantly scanning the yard for any sign of movement. He had no idea where they were going to go next, but one thing was certain, he wasn't going to stop until the boy was safe. John's pulse thudded in his ears as he crouched low, still clutching the boy in his arms. Every step they took through the factory yard felt like an eternity. The stillness of the night was shattered by the distant hum of machinery, but that only heightened the sense of danger. It was as if the world was holding its breath, and so was he. The shadows seemed to stretch on forever, making it hard to judge how far they'd gone or how close they were to safety. John's every instinct told him to keep moving, to get as far away from the factory as possible. The boy was still trembling in his arms, his small body shaking with fear. But John couldn't slow down. Every second counted. They reached the edge of the factory grounds, where a large gate led to a dimly lit street. It was their best chance to get away from whoever was after them. But as John approached the gate, the unmistakable sound of tires screeching against asphalt froze him in place. His heart leapt into his throat. A black SUV, a vehicle he'd seen parked earlier, came into view, its headlights piercing through the darkness. The car came to a screeching halt near the gate, just a few dozen feet from where John and the boy were hiding. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as the SUV's engine revved loudly, and the vehicle's doors swung open. Stay down, John whispered urgently to the boy, pressing him close to the ground behind a row of stacked crates. They were dangerously close to being spotted, but there was no turning back now. John's hand clenched tightly around the boy, heart racing as he scanned the area. The figures of two men emerged from the SUV, both tall and dressed in dark clothing. They looked like they knew exactly where they were going. They were heading straight for the gate. The boy in John's arms stiffened, and John's grip tightened instinctively. The child was breathing rapidly, his small chest rising and falling in the shadows. He could feel the boy's fear, but John wasn't about to let them be caught. Not now, not after everything they had gone through. John couldn't risk being discovered. He glanced around quickly, looking for cover, but they were exposed. The crates were just a few feet away, and if they were spotted, there was no telling what might happen. The men were getting closer, and John could hear them talking in low voices, but he couldn't make out the words. Move now, John thought to himself, trying to steady his breath. The sound of the men's footsteps grew louder, and he realized that they were mere seconds away from coming into view. He had to act. With a burst of adrenaline, John sprang to his feet, ducking and pulling the boy behind him as they dashed toward the next line of crates. He could hear the men shouting behind them, but there was no time to stop. Don't look back. Just move forward. John could feel the boy's small body trembling against him, but the fear was mutual. They were running for their lives, and every second mattered. The workers' exit was only a few yards away now, but the men in the SUV were chasing them, getting closer with each step. John's mind raced through possibilities, but there was no perfect solution. He had to get them both out of sight and make sure they didn't get cornered. His thoughts were interrupted by a loud, booming voice coming from behind them. Stop right there. John's heart stopped. They had been spotted. His eyes scanned the yard for any possible escape routes. The factory gate was now nearly within reach, but it was no longer an option. The men were closing in too quickly. John realized they couldn't outrun them. They'd have to outsmart them. John skidded to a halt and yanked the boy behind a stack of crates, pressing his back against the cold metal, trying to make as little noise as possible. The footsteps grew louder. The men were almost on top of them. His heart pounded in his chest. He could hear them now, close enough that they could see the crates they were hiding behind. Where are you? One of the men hissed, frustration in his voice. You think you can hide from us forever? John's grip on the boy tightened, but he didn't dare make a sound. Every muscle in his body was tensed, ready to spring into action. He knew that if they were caught, there would be no telling what would happen next. The men stopped in front of the crates. John's mind raced, trying to figure out how to escape. He could hear their heavy breathing, the frustration building. If they were close enough to hear, they were close enough to find them. Then, just as the men began to move around the crates, a distant siren sounded. It was faint at first, but it grew louder as it approached. The sound of approaching police sirens made John's heart leap into his throat. He had no idea where they were coming from, but it was a glimmer of hope. The men hesitated. One of them cursed under his breath, then turned to the other. We need to get out of here. Fast. The other man cursed as well, and for a moment, the tension in the air was palpable. Then, in a split second, they turned and ran back toward the SUV. The sound of their footsteps retreated into the distance. John stood frozen for a moment, unable to believe they were safe. He listened intently as the sirens continued to approach, but the men were gone. The factory yard, once a place of danger, was now eerily quiet again. He held the boy tighter, his heart still pounding in his chest. They had narrowly escaped, but they weren't out of the woods yet. The police might arrive soon, but John wasn't going to take any chances. He needed to get the boy to safety. They weren't done running yet. John's breath was coming in ragged gasps, and the boy in his arms was still shaking uncontrollably. The police sirens were getting closer, but John knew they couldn't wait for them to arrive. The immediate danger from the men in the SUV was over, but the situation was far from safe. He could hear the men's voices fading into the distance, but there was no guarantee they wouldn't turn around and come back. John gently lowered the boy to the ground, making sure the child was steady on his feet. His small body still trembled, but he was starting to calm down, his big eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. John ran a hand through his hair, his heart pounding with the realization of how close they had come to disaster. The factory yard was still as silent as before, except for the distant sound of the police sirens. John knew they didn't have much time to make their next move. He scanned the area, looking for an exit, a way out that didn't expose them to further danger. The boy's life was in his hands, and there was no room for mistakes now. There's a back alley behind the factory, John said quietly, his voice low but firm. It's not far. and it should be safer than staying out in the open. The boy's gaze flickered up at him, uncertainty still in his eyes. John could see the fear, but also the faintest hint of trust. The boy had been through something unimaginable, and yet he was following John's lead, relying on him for safety. It was a bond that had been formed in the chaos of the past few hours. John picked the boy up again, cradling him in his arms as they began to move toward the back alley. His legs were shaky, his body still recovering from the adrenaline rush, but he couldn't afford to stop. They couldn't stop. The back alley was tucked away behind the factory, a narrow space where workers sometimes took breaks. It wasn't a glamorous place by any means, just a dingy stretch of concrete surrounded by high walls and a few discarded boxes. But right now, it was the safest place they could get to without being noticed. As they reached the alley, John quickly ducked behind a stack of wooden crates, pressing his back against the cool concrete. The boy was silent in his arms now, his small body still trembling, but quieter. It was as if the boy knew they had finally reached a temporary haven. John's eyes darted to the street beyond, listening for any sounds of movement. The police sirens were much louder now, their wail echoing through the quiet night. He couldn't make out the exact location of the officers, but he knew they were close. Still, there was no telling when the men in the SUV would return. They hadn't given up yet. John glanced down at the boy. The child's face was pale, his clothes dirty, and his hair matted with sweat and dirt. He looked like he hadn't eaten in days, like he had been through hell. But there was something else in his eyes now, something that made John's heart ache. The boy had survived, and now they had a chance to get him to safety. "Do you know where your family is?" John asked softly, crouching down to the boy's level. He wanted to be gentle, to reassure him, but the questions had to be asked. "Are you lost?" The boy didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the ground, his small hands twisting nervously in his lap. John could feel the tension building in the air, the uncertainty between them hanging like a heavy fog. The boy seemed to be working up the courage to speak, but the silence stretched on. Finally, the boy lifted his eyes, and his voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "I don't know where they are," he said, his words shaky. They left me. I ran." John's heart clenched. He didn't know who had left the boy or why, but the child's words confirmed his worst fear. The boy hadn't just wandered into the factory on his own. He was running from someone, and whoever had been chasing him had no intention of letting him go. John clenched his jaw, his fists tightening as he fought the overwhelming surge of anger and helplessness. Who would do something like this to a child? He glanced down at the boy again, trying to offer a reassuring smile, but he could feel the weight of the situation sinking in. The boy had been abandoned and had nowhere to turn. Until now. John wasn't going to let anything happen to him. Not on his watch. "Listen," John said, his voice calm but filled with determination. "You're safe now. I promise you. We're going to get you to a place where you'll be taken care of. You don't have to worry about anything else." The boy nodded, but the fear in his eyes didn't completely fade. John knew it wouldn't disappear overnight. The trauma, the fear, the uncertainty, it would take time to heal. But for now, he could give the boy safety. He could give him a chance to escape whatever had been hunting him. John knew the police would be here soon. He could hear the sirens growing closer. He just needed to keep the boy hidden for a little while longer. Once the authorities arrived, they could sort everything out. They would figure out who was responsible for chasing the boy and what had led to this dangerous situation. "Stay here," John whispered, standing up quickly. "I'll go see if it's safe to leave the alley. Stay out of sight, okay?" The boy nodded, his wide eyes still filled with a mix of fear and exhaustion. John didn't want to leave him alone, but he couldn't just sit here. They needed to be certain they weren't going to be discovered. The last thing he wanted was for the boy to be taken again. John slipped cautiously out of the alley and peered around the corner. The police cars were now in the distance, their lights flashing in the darkened street. The officers were moving toward the factory entrance, clearly unaware of what had happened behind the scenes. John exhaled in relief. The moment of danger had passed, for now. He returned to the boy's side, ready to move. With one last glance at the quiet, darkened factory, John knew they were about to leave it all behind. It was a new beginning for both of them, but their journey wasn't over yet. John led the boy away from the darkened alley and toward the back streets of the city, careful not to draw attention to them. His mind raced through what had just transpired. The close calls, the rush to keep the boy safe. And yet, there was still so much unknown. He needed answers, and the boy clearly needed help. As they walked in silence, the boy held tightly to John's hand, his small fingers trembling. John's protective instincts kicked in, and he glanced down at the boy every few seconds, making sure he was okay. The boy hadn't spoken since their quiet conversation in the alley, but John could feel the weight of his fear in every step. This was more than just a child lost in the factory. This was a child running from something far darker. Finally, after a few more blocks, John found a small diner that was still open, the neon sign flickering weakly in the night. The diner's warmth contrasted with the cold night air, offering a brief sense of comfort. John pushed open the door, and they stepped inside. The waitress, an older woman with a kind face, looked up from the counter. She smiled, but her expression faltered when she saw John holding the frightened child. She immediately stood up, concern washing over her features. "Are you okay?" the waitress asked, her voice soft but filled with genuine worry. "What happened? You look like you've been through the ringer." John hesitated for a moment. The last thing he wanted was to involve others in the chaos, but he knew they couldn't just keep running forever. The police were probably already searching the factory for any signs of the boy's whereabouts, but they needed a safe place to regroup, and this diner felt like as good a place as any. "Can we just sit for a moment?" John asked, his voice low but steady. The waitress nodded and led them to a booth near the back, away from prying eyes. John sat down first, pulling the boy gently beside him. The boy, still clutching his sleeve, looked up at John with silent gratitude in his eyes. But there was also an overwhelming sadness that John couldn't ignore. This child wasn't just scared. He had been through something much worse than anyone should have to endure. The waitress handed them 2 cups of water, offering a sympathetic smile. She didn't press for details, but John could see the curiosity in her eyes. "Thank you," John said quietly, taking a sip from the glass. "We just need a place to wait for a bit. We've had a rough night." The waitress nodded. "Of course. You stay as long as you need. Let me know if I can get you anything else." John nodded in thanks, but his attention was back on the boy, who was now staring out the diner window, looking lost in thought. He could tell that the boy was exhausted, physically, mentally, and emotionally. John wanted to know more about what had happened, what had led to this moment, but he knew the boy wasn't ready to talk. He needed time to process everything, just like John needed time to figure out what to do next. The diner was quiet, save for the occasional clink of dishes and the soft hum of the refrigerator. John's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The boy had been hiding under the machinery for a reason. The fact that he was running from someone or something, was a clear sign that there was much more to this story than he could have imagined. But who were the men chasing him? Why had they gone to such extreme lengths to find him? John's thoughts were interrupted when the boy spoke, his voice soft and barely audible. "Why are you helping me?" the boy asked, his eyes still downcast. "I don't know you." John's heart tightened at the question. He hadn't expected it, but he also knew it was coming. The boy had been through so much, and he had no reason to trust anyone, especially a stranger. John had no answers, but he had to reassure him somehow. "I don't know," John said honestly, his voice steady. "But you needed help, and I couldn't just leave you there, not after what I saw. You're not alone anymore." The boy didn't reply, but he looked up at John, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. It was clear that he didn't know how to process the kindness being offered to him. As they sat in silence, John's thoughts raced. The police would likely be looking for the boy by now, but John didn't want to involve the authorities until he understood the full story. He needed to make sure the boy was safe and that he wasn't running from something worse. But before he could even begin to think about what to do next, a familiar sound came from the diner's entrance. John froze. The sound of a car door slamming echoed through the diner, and his heart skipped a beat. His instincts flared, and he quickly glanced toward the door. A black SUV, the same one from earlier, was parked right outside. Panic rose in John's chest as he quickly stood, but before he could say anything, the boy stood up as well, his eyes wide with fear. "Please," the boy whispered, his voice trembling. "Don't let them find me." John's heart dropped. He grabbed the boy's hand, pulling him close. "Stay here. Don't move." He turned toward the waitress, who had stopped in her tracks, watching them closely. "Please, can you keep us out of sight?" John asked urgently, his voice low. "There's a black SUV outside. I think they're after him." The waitress didn't hesitate. "Stay in the back. I'll handle it." She led them to the small storage area at the back of the diner, closing the door quietly behind them. John and the boy stayed there, hidden from view, as they listened to the faint sound of footsteps approaching. John's heart raced, his thoughts still trying to make sense of what was happening. Why had the men come after the boy again? What were they after? And how could he protect him? The minutes stretched on like hours, but eventually, the sound of footsteps faded. The SUV was gone. John exhaled slowly, feeling the tension lift slightly, but the situation was far from over. He had no idea what would happen next or what the boys' future held, but for the moment, they were safe. The minutes seemed to crawl by as John and the boy remained hidden in the storage area behind the diner. Every sound, every distant car horn, and the occasional murmur of voices from outside felt like an eternity, sending waves of anxiety through John. The boy, still shaking with fear, clung to John's side, his small body stiff with tension. John could feel the weight of the moment. He was responsible for this child's safety now, and every decision was crucial. Finally, after what felt like an endless stretch of silence, the waitress returned, her face betraying the briefest hint of relief. She cracked the door to the back storage area and gestured for them to follow. "They're gone," she whispered, as if to confirm what they had both been silently dreading. "I don't know where they went, but they've left." John let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He could feel the weight of the situation shifting, but the fear wasn't gone. The boy still needed protection, and the danger was far from over. "Thank you," John said quietly as they stepped back into the diner, the warmth of the place almost jarring after the cold tension they'd just experienced. The waitress smiled warmly, but there was still a trace of concern in her eyes. "I didn't want to ask too many questions. But you too, you're welcome to stay here as long as you need. I'll keep an eye out." John nodded gratefully and sat the boy down at a booth in the corner of the diner, keeping his back to the wall, and his eyes constantly scanning the windows and doors. His protective instincts were still in full force. He hadn't let his guard down for a second, not since he'd found the boy in the factory, and he wasn't about to now. The boy hadn't said a word since they had hidden in the back of the diner, but John could feel the weight of his silent gaze. His eyes were still filled with uncertainty, like the boy wasn't sure where he was or what would happen next. He wasn't just physically exhausted. John could see the emotional toll the events of the night had taken on him. He needed answers, but he knew the boy wasn't ready to talk yet. As they sat there in the dim light of the diner, John tried to think about their next steps. He didn't have all the answers, and the boy's story still seemed like a puzzle with too many missing pieces. What had led the boy to hide in the factory? Who were the men in the SUV, and why were they chasing him? What kind of life had this child been forced to live? "They were going to hurt me." John froze at the words. He didn't ask what exactly the boy meant, or how he knew. He didn't need to. It was clear enough. The men weren't just after the boy, they were after him for a reason. A dark, terrifying reason. "They wanted me to." The boy hesitated, his voice faltering. "They wanted me to do something, but I didn't want to." John leaned forward slightly, his tone calm but firm. "What do you mean? What did they want you to do?" The boy shrunk back slightly, the fear still evident in his eyes. "I don't know. They kept saying I owed them. I didn't know who they were, but they kept telling me that I was supposed to work for them. I was supposed to do things for them." He paused, his breath coming in shallow bursts. "I didn't want to, but they kept chasing me. They wanted me to come with them." John's chest tightened as he absorbed the boy's words. His mind raced as the realization dawned on him. The boy had been targeted, hunted even, by people who had an agenda he didn't understand. They had been hunting him for some unknown reason, and the boy had done what any child would do: run. "You did the right thing," John said quietly, looking the boy in the eyes. "You didn't let them control you. You got away, and now you're safe." The boy nodded slightly, but his eyes still showed the weight of the fear that had consumed him for so long. John could see the child was torn between relief and uncertainty. The danger wasn't gone yet, but they were safe, for now. After a long silence, the boy looked up at John, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you? Why are you helping me?" John hesitated for a moment. He had no grand answers. He wasn't some hero or savior. He was just a factory worker who had happened to walk in at the right, or wrong, moment. But the boy needed reassurance, and John wasn't about to turn his back on him now. "I'm just someone who saw you needed help," John said quietly, offering a reassuring smile. "That's all." The boy stared at him for a long moment, his eyes still filled with doubt, but John saw something flicker there. A glimmer of trust. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The boy had been through so much, but at least now he wasn't alone. John felt the weight of his responsibility. He had promised to protect the boy, and he would keep that promise, no matter what. But they still had a long road ahead. The men in the SUV were still out there. The boy wasn't safe yet. The situation was far from over, and John knew that the real challenges were only just beginning. Just as John began to speak again, asking if the boy had any family or if he had any idea where he could go next, the diner's door creaked open. A man in a uniform stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. John's heart skipped a beat as the man's gaze settled on their booth. The man in the uniform entered the diner with an air of authority, his eyes scanning the room as if he was looking for someone specific. John's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, he felt as though the room had gone cold, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The boy was still sitting beside him, clutching his sleeve tightly, and John's mind raced with options. Was this the police? Had they found him? Or was it someone else? The man's gaze finally settled on their booth. For a brief moment, John wondered if he should try to hide or make a run for it. But he couldn't. The boy needed answers, and they couldn't keep running forever. The man took a few steps toward them, his movements steady and measured. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice low but firm. "Are you John Miller?" John stiffened at the mention of his name. How did he know who I am? His mind raced, trying to piece together who this man might be. The boy looked up at John, fear still clouding his small face. "Yes," John replied cautiously, his voice calm but laced with suspicion. "Who are you?" The man didn't immediately respond. Instead, he took a step closer, his eyes flickering to the boy, then back to John. "I'm Detective Harris," he said finally, pulling out a badge from his coat pocket. "We've been looking for the boy you're with." John's stomach dropped. So this wasn't the police just trying to help. This was something else, something darker. "The boy's not going anywhere with you," John said quickly, standing up to block the boy from view. His protective instincts flared again, and he stepped in front of the boy, his posture rigid. "What do you want with him?" Detective Harris studied him for a moment, his face unreadable. "It's not that simple, Mr. Miller," he said slowly, his tone calm but serious. "This boy is part of a larger investigation. He's involved in something far beyond what you think." John's chest tightened. "What are you talking about?" "He's just a child. He's been running from people who've been after him." "What is this all about?" Detective Harris took a deep breath, glancing around the diner to make sure no one was listening. Then, with a more urgent tone, he continued. "The boy you're protecting, his name is Ethan, and he's been on the run for a while now. We've been tracking a criminal syndicate involved in trafficking and illegal activities, and Ethan is one of the victims caught in the middle." John's blood ran cold as the detective's words sank in. "Trafficking?" he repeated, the gravity of the situation finally hitting him. "Yes," Harris confirmed. "The people after him, those men you saw earlier, they're part of a much larger operation. Ethan was supposed to be part of their group, but he ran. We've been trying to catch up with him for months. The people who want him are dangerous, and you have no idea what you've just stepped into." John's mind reeled. A child caught up in something like that? It felt impossible. The boy in his arms, the one who had been shaking with fear, was somehow wrapped up in a criminal organization. How had this happened? "So why do you want him back?" John asked, his voice steady despite the rising panic inside him. "Why didn't you help him sooner?" Detective Harris sighed, his expression softening slightly as he looked at Ethan. "We've been trying to protect him, but this isn't just about protection anymore. Ethan's been exposed to things that no child should see. The people after him don't stop. They'll never stop. We've had to operate under the radar, trying to keep him out of their hands while also keeping an eye on the bigger network." John shook his head. "You can't just tell me to give him up. I'm not letting him go with anyone until I know he's safe." Harris held up a hand, a sign of calm. "I understand your concern, Mr. Miller. I truly do. But what I'm trying to tell you is that keeping Ethan here, hiding him away, it's not enough. If you want him to have a future, he needs to come with us. We can protect him better than anyone else, and we can bring down the people who've been chasing him. But that can't happen if he's constantly running." Ethan, still sitting quietly by the booth, looked up at John, his wide eyes filled with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. His tiny fingers gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "I don't want to go back," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. "I just want to be safe." John's heart clenched. The boy had been through so much. He was still just a child, and here he was, caught up in a world he didn't belong to. John felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had promised to protect the boy, but what was the right choice here? Who could be trusted? John turned to Harris, his mind racing. "If I let you take him, what happens then? How can I trust you? How do I know you can protect him?" Harris met John's gaze, his expression serious but sincere. "We have the resources to keep him safe. We have people who have been working for years to take down this syndicate, and we're closer than ever. But we need his help to finish it. We need him to testify, to tell us what he knows. It's the only way to end this, to ensure he never has to run again. John swallowed hard. He wasn't sure he could trust the detective completely, but there was a part of him that knew this was the only way forward. The boy needed more than just temporary safety. He needed a real chance at a future. And that future would only come if those dangerous people were stopped. John looked at Ethan, who was now gazing up at him with a mixture of fear and hope in his eyes. John's heart broke for him. "Do you want to go with him?" John asked quietly, his voice filled with genuine care. Ethan looked at the detective, then back at John. For a moment, the boy didn't say anything, just looking back and forth between them. The weight of the decision was too much for a child to carry alone. Finally, Ethan nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to be safe." John nodded, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this was the right thing to do. He could see the boy's trust in him, and he knew that he couldn't abandon him now, even if it meant letting him go into the care of strangers. The child had been through too much. He had to have a chance at a life without fear. "Okay," John said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll let you take him, but I want to make sure he's safe." Harris nodded, his expression softening. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. We'll make sure he's safe. We'll keep him under protection, and you'll have answers soon. I promise you that." John took one last look at Ethan, who was still gripping his sleeve. The boy's eyes held a mixture of relief and uncertainty, but John knew this was the best chance for him. As John stepped aside, allowing the detective to take the boy into custody, he felt a pang of sadness. But there was also hope, a hope that, despite the nightmare Ethan had endured, he now had a future without fear. The men walked out of the diner, and as John watched them disappear into the night, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had helped save a life, and in the end, that was all that mattered. As the sound of the detective's footsteps faded into the night, John stood there, still processing everything that had transpired. The weight of the decision lingered, but in his heart, he knew he had made the right choice. Ethan was safe. For the first time in what felt like forever, the boy would have the chance to live without fear, to experience a future free from the shadows that had haunted him. John took a deep breath, his mind replaying the entire ordeal. He had done what he could. He had saved a life, and that was something he could be proud of. What do you think would have happened if you were in his shoes? John's voice rang out softly in the silence, an unspoken invitation for you, the viewer, to reflect. If you ever faced a moment of life or death decisions, what would you do? Could you rise to the occasion? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable stories.